This video is brought to you by Harold Sack, who gave me a massive 1 year's worth of subscriptions on Patreon. Vraan versus Titania. We have some sack outlets, Dorothy Voidwalker, a means of aristocrat stuff. We'll try it, but I'm not hopeful that we'll get anywhere, especially if we don't draw into lands. So seeing as how we've got multiple sack outlets available to us, we'll get out a turn 1 carrion feeder. Turn 1 Sol Ring for the green player, which takes him into Expedition map. 3 cards in hand only though. And we draw into a Cabal Coffers, so not the best land we could have drawn into. Let's play out the Dorothy Voidwalker, might be able to get a Cultivate from our opponent or something. A Verdant Catacombs only from our opponent, so they're just holding up the Expedition map, I would have thought. And there is another sack outlet for us, so yeah, just need the token generators to go with it at this point. Might as well play out our commander. Probably worth stealing the Expedition map from our opponent actually, so that we can go for Urborg now that we've got the Cabal Coffers. Might make our opponent think twice about Expedition map. Cracking the Verdant Catacombs, which does go into exile. And they decide not to go for the Expedition map, so maybe because of the Shade being in play. Inventor's Fair from our opponent. They don't have the double green for their commander, but there is an Hour of Promise. So yeah, not much chance of casting that so far with only 2 mana available to us. If they go for a Yavimaya here, we will be able to tap down the Cabal Coffers for mana at least. And they do, so there is Yavimaya. They've gone for Field of the Dead, as you would expect as well. Alright, and there is a Sol Ring, so we can go for the Sol Ring here, and yeah, do we just go for the Yawgmoth? I think that's a good use of our mana here. We're not going to make use of Bastion of Remembrance yet anyway. Let's land some damage while we can. It's a decent chunk of damage we're dealing, and the Field of the Dead is going to start triggering fairly soon, I imagine. Mouth of Ronan is going to deal 4 damage to a target creature, so they are playing around the Dorothy Voidwalker here and not cracking the Expedition map by the looks of it, so we're buying ourselves a decent chunk of time. Let's go for -1/-1 onto nothing and sacrifice the Dorothy Voidwalker. Our opponent will be drained for 2, and we will draw a card to the Yawgmoth. And there is a Bloodchief Ascension, which we'll be able to get a counter on next turn. And then they get down another tap land, so they've got the land that they need to make Titania Gaia Incarnate. And now seeing a Murderous Rider, which can go onto that commander. I don't think it has hexproof or anything. Nope. So yeah, we are playing out the Bloodchief Ascension definitely here. And after that it can be the Bastion of Remembrance, which will make a token, and might just sacrifice the token straight away so that we can try and make a land drop. We'll swing in first with everything. So taking our opponent down to 21, and yeah, let's sacrifice the human token now. I don't think there's any dorks that we're going to have to get rid of. Our opponent's only got 2 cards in hand. So we'll drain our opponent for 3, when you include the Bastion of Remembrance and our commander. And of course we draw a card to the Yawgmoth. There is a Phyrexian Reclamation, which we couldn't have cast anyway, so not having the best of luck here, but we're managing to cobble a bit of something together. Always yes and yield onto the Bloodchief Ascension. Need 3 counters on that in order for this to become relevant. 6 lands in play for our opponent now. And there is Titania, Voice of Gaia. And then activating the Argoth, Sanctum of Nature. No means of putting more lands in their bin yet, and they don't have any in the bin either. A Defiler of Vigor, Zuran Orb, and a Sylvan Library. They made a bear token. Okay, there is Iara, First of Locthwain. So I think we have to make use of the Cabal Coffers. That will make us 2 black mana. And then we can go for Iara, First of Locthwain. So that enters, it will drain our opponent for 1. And then we can use the Yawgmoth to put a minus counter. Yeah, put it on the bear token, and we can sacrifice this carrion feeder. We're not shy on sack outlets. And that will have our opponent lose enough life to put another counter on the Bloodchief Ascension. And alright, Orpheomancer is excellent with the Yawgmoth, so I'm sure we'll get into lands eventually. Actually, didn't get the Phyrexian Reclamation into play there when we could have done, but yeah, I don't think it's going to matter. We could have gone for the Dorothy Voidwalker next turn, I suppose. But while we're shy on mana, it's going to be pretty difficult. And Expedition map being cracked finally. Now seeing a Strip Mine from our opponents, so let's see if they want to blow up the Cabal Coffers. They do. So leaving us on only 2 lands. They gain 2 life from the Titania for doing that. And then Argoth, Sanctum of Nature, going to create another bear token after they've milled. And there we see some more lands. Basic, the Nykthos, a Strip Mine. I think they need 4 in the bin, do they? Yeah, 4 or more lands in the graveyard to flip that round. Alright, so we do get into a swamp here. Had I have gone for the Phyrexian Reclamation, we could have activated it and played out the Dorothy Voidwalker here, which might have been relevant, but yeah, maybe should have done that. Instead we'll get out the Ophiomancer, I think. Our opponent isn't going to flip around the Titania. Our opponent could have crop rotation here to get the 4th land into the bin. Anyway, we'll go for Ophiomancer. And then if we want to get the counter on Bloodchief Ascension this turn, then we could sacrifice the Iara, but I think the drain and potential card draw from Iara could be useful, so I'll instead do here what I should have done last turn and go for the Phyrexian Reclamation. So we see the Ophiomancer trigger here, getting us into a snake, and that drains our opponent for 1. 4 cards in our opponent's hand here, and going for what looks like a 4-mana spell. Crucible of Worlds going to take lands out of the bin, but I mean, they can just start abusing Strip Mine, I suppose. And yeah, it is the Strip Mine that they're going after here. So blowing up our swamp, we will tap that down for black just to show our opponent something. And let's, in response, go after the Titania with the snake. So -1/-1 will get the final counter on Bloodchief Ascension at the end of the turn here, after draining our opponent's sum down to 13. And they gain 2 life from the Titania and the Strip Mine hitting the graveyard there. And there is a splendid Reclamation, so yeah, they're nowhere near flipping around the Titania at least, but they do get that Strip Mine back. That starts to trigger the Field of the Dead, so want to be getting to a point now where we can actually drain our opponent out. Not too much in the form of green mana and devotion here though, so Nykthos isn't as good as it could be, but obviously ramping way ahead of us here. Bloodchief Ascension getting that 3rd counter like I said, so anything that they do with lands now is going to drain them for 2. Ophiomancer going to drain them for 1 when it enters, thanks to the Iara. And we finally drawing into swamps here and a Verdant Catacombs. So let's make our opponent think twice about going for that Strip Mine. We'll grab the Dorothy Voidwalker here, and then we'll play out the Dorothy Voidwalker. And that drains our opponent again, so we go up to 50. And I think it is sacrificing the snake, putting a minus counter onto the Titania, and that will drain our opponent. Vraan only ever triggers once during each turn, but obviously with something like an Ophiomancer we can trigger it every single turn, and that will soon mount up. So our opponent goes down to 10. We draw into a Swiftfoot Boots, which we can't play thanks to the lack of mana. So like I said, the Bloodchief Ascension is online now. It'll drain our opponent for 2 every time one of their permanents hits the bin, or is it any card? Yeah, it's whenever a card, so that does include tokens here. They do hit the bin and then evaporate straight away. So we could go after the bear token to drain them for 2 if we want to. There's a Saga into the Field of the Dead, going to trigger it for more zombies. And they might be able to eventually get something like a Skull Clamp from the Urza Saga, so best to deal with them as soon as we can. They've got 2 cards in hand. Could see something like an overrun effect here, I suppose, but we are at 53 life, so it'll have to be a Crater Hoof or something like that. Garruk Primal Hunter. Don't really have any big creatures in play, so they can't draw too many cards with that. So making a 3/3 beast with the Garruk instead. They do have way more devotion to green now thanks to the enchantment, so that's relevant, but we'll go through to the end step here, and then we will go for Yawgmoth. We'll get rid of that bear token in order to trigger the Bloodchief Ascension. Sacrifice the snake in order to do it. That triggers the Bastion, triggers the Vraan as well, so they will lose 2, 4 and 5 life there. And basically we can just sacrifice all our creatures and get rid of our opponent. We were drawing into a Wretched Confluence, which will draw into even more cards. Got thrown out into the lobby there, so can't show you the Wretched Confluence, but that can kill off creatures as well for more effects in the Aristocrats department. And then obviously would have drawn even more to Yawgmoth, even more during the draw step. So yeah, pretty sketchy one, but our opponent was going pretty liberal with the Strip Mine, so I think we did quite well. We'll try another one. Up against Vishgraz this time, and we already have more mana. Pretty slow hand, but we can curve out alright, so we'll try it. Each of us just getting down a swamp here. We draw into Demonic Tutor, so I think we're alright to go after the Vraan here and just hope that our opponent doesn't have any spot removal for it. And Arcane Signet for our opponent will fix some of their colours quite nicely because they do have double basic swamps in play at the moment. And there is a Murderous Rider ready for, likely, their commander. We can hope for another land here, and next turn maybe go Demonic Tutor into Bitter Blossom. So we'll try and land as much damage as we can here by playing out a Yahenni. That does have haste, so we can deal 4 points of damage. As we saw in the previous game, it can matter that you get into combat as soon as you possibly can. And then we see Toski, Bearer of Secrets, so yeah, it would be useful to get into the Yawgmoth again to get rid of that. Alright, and we do see a High Market, another sack outlet as well, so we will go for the Demonic Tutor. And I think I will get down the Bitter Blossom here because it is a means of consistent sacrifice fodder. And I'm not going to bother swinging in here. We can't get through. We can go wide on our opponent for 2, but then they just hit us back and draw a card. We'll hold off on as much card draw as possible from them. And it's an Aura Mutation, so they immediately deal with the Bitter Blossom and get some Saprolings in the way. And they do have to swing in with Toski here. So we'll just block with the Yahenni. And alright, a swamp is nice, so drop the swamp and we are fine. To not have a sack outlet held up on the High Market, we'll just go for the Solemn Simulacrum here. And then we can actually block what they're going in for. And that will be a means of card draw for us as well, obviously. Obviously we're just setting up here. Blight Mound is another means of making tokens and stuff, but yeah, it's not the best thing that we could have. Just holding back blockers again thanks to that Toski. And now I expect that we see our opponent's commander. They have tapped down all 5 mana. And no, instead it is Kaya the Inexorable, which we can get rid of with the Murderous Rider. So they decide to get rid of the Yahenni. That is exile as opposed to destroy, so can't avoid this. Yahenni can't sacrifice itself, so yeah, we'll just let that go. And then if they want to try and go wide on us here to draw a card, then they'll open up their Kaya. So just swinging in with the Toski, throw the Solemn in the way. And then for us it is a Sword of the Animist, so we could play and equip that, but then we don't have the mana for the Murderous Rider, and I think we need to deal with the Kaya. So let's go Swift End onto the Kaya, blowing up a Planeswalker, and then we can play this out as a 2/3 lifelinker as well, so have to bear that in mind. As for now, we just go for the Blight Mound, I think. So now we see our opponent slam down the Vishgraz, and once again just having to swing in with Toski. I thought he'd dedicate more to the Saprolings there, but deciding not to lose out on one of those. And there is another swamp for us, so I think it has to be a spawning pit for us, so that we can potentially sacrifice the Solemn Simulacrum. We'll play out the Murderous Rider here, and then it is a Beastmaster Ascension, so they need 7 counters on that, I think it is. Yeah, 7 counters. They've got 7 creatures in play, so that's obviously what their aim's been the whole time. That's why they didn't throw the Saprolings away. And in a mono black deck, we're not likely to do anything against the Beastmaster Ascension. They don't have Trample on anything, at least. They do have Menace on the Vishgraz though. And it doesn't matter how much a toxic creature is buffed, it's not like Infect. If it has Toxic 1 and it's a 20/20, then they still only put 1 Infect counter on us. But they do also deal the damage as well, so Beastmaster Ascension going to buff everything up by a huge amount. Throw Murderous Rider and the Solemn in the way of the toxic creatures. So we just have to throw away all of our creatures here. I don't see that we're going to do much of anything unless we get into a board wipe. So we should sacrifice things in response so that we can make a creature with the Spawning Pit. So get rid of Solemn Simulacrum to draw a card. That will trigger the Vraan, which will only trigger once this turn. Puts a charge counter on the Spawning Pit, of which we need 2. Blight Mound will make us a Pest token as well. Draw into Read the Bones, which gives us a slight chance. Sack the Murderous Rider as well. That will get shuffled back into our library and make us another Pest token. And then we sacrifice Vraan to its own ability. It does not trigger on itself, just to make Vraan even worse, but we can make a Spawn Artifact token here. So I do end up with some tokens in play, but I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to do with them. Anyway, our opponent hits with 4 creatures, so drawing 4 cards with the Toski, and then hard casting a Search for Tomorrow. And there is an Avacyn's Pilgrim, so let's sacrifice one of these pest tokens and we can upgrade it to a Spawning Pit token. We gain a life whenever it dies. Alright, and a Verdant Catacombs for us, so I think we can just play that out and crack it. Then it's Read the Bones, have a potential to look at up to 4 cards here. Bastion of Remembrance, yeah, it's too late really. Phyrexian Reclamation isn't going to do much of anything for us either. So we'll bottom both of those and hope that we get into a board wipe, but we don't. It's just a swamp for us, so we will concede there, I think. Make sure to say good game to our opponent, and we will try another one. Okay, the same opponent seems to have jumped into a game with us again, but this time up against Yoshimaru and Raihan. Yeah, and again, we're not doing too well on our opening hands here, which is half the problem, I think. Okay, there we've got a board wipe and a sack outlet, so we'll keep that. We're on the play as well, so had to go down a card, but don't get to draw up to our 7th card thanks to being on the play as opposed to on the draw. So there is a swamp, and we'll get down the Bloodchief Ascension, ready to start dumping counters on that. Avacyn's Pilgrim from our opponent. We're just playing the long game here, I think, and going for the Toxic Deluge when our opponent's got a bunch of stuff into play. So we'll get as many swamps in as possible because we might draw into one of the Cabal lands. And we see a Search for Tomorrow from our opponent on turn 2. That allows him into a Plains, and therefore the Yoshimaru Ever Faithful as well. Alright, and there's an extra planar lens for us, so I think we drop the extra planar lens, and if they have enchantment and artifact removal, then it will likely go on the lens as opposed to the Bloodchief Ascension. A Reiki, the History of Kamigawa, so I think that's a decent time to go for the board wipe. It'd be nice to wrap up the Raihan, but yeah, I don't want them to be drawing extra cards with the Reiki. Alright, and there is a Black Market Connections for us, so we drop the Phyrexian Tower, which means we can't go Black Market Connections here, annoyingly. Or we can go Black Market Connections, but we can't go for the Toxic Deluge as well, so I'll just go for the Black Market Connections instead, and then maybe we can wrap up the Raihan in a Toxic Deluge. Alright, that is Felisa, Fang of the Silver Quill. Don't think I ever made this. I was really looking forward to playing with it, and it took Magic Online forever and a day to actually release it on the client, so yeah, good to wrap it up in this board wipe, I'm sure. They'll get an Inkling because they do have a legendary creature with a plus counter on it, but could be worse. We do get to get rid of the Felisa before it does some real damage here. So we go down to 31 and 5 points of Commander. There's a Solemn Simulacrum where, yeah, we're getting into all the stuff that we don't want to be drawing into, sort of. Put Trigger on the stack. We want an extra card and we want a treasure as well. No point making the creature if we're going to wipe the board here. So we lose 3 life at the beginning of the turn, going south of 30. Bontu's Monument doesn't help us with Solemn. So we just play out the Solemn Simulacrum here and say yes for sure, so that we can actually make some land drops this game. And then Phyrexian Tower, sacrificing the Solemn Simulacrum, will draw us a card, and that gets us into Feed the Swarm. It's just Toxic Deluge here for, yeah, we can do it for 3. And that triggers the Felisa, so they're going to get an Inkling, like I said. Oh, actually, they get 2 Inklings. I've forgotten what this does clearly. Where X is the number of counters it had on it, alright. So obviously there were 2 counters on the Yoshimaru, so they get 2 Inkling tokens. And straight into play again comes Yoshimaru. And then we see a Criminal Past, which is a background. Commander creatures you own have Menace and plus X to their power, where X is the number of creatures in your graveyard, so we've just enabled that. And it is 2 2/1 Flying Inklings at us, sending us down to 21. Okay, and there's a Polluted Delta for us, so we'll go Black Market Connections again, and don't think we necessarily need the treasure here, so let's just make a creature and we'll draw a card. So we'll lose 5 life, unfortunately. Alright, and there's a Genesis Chamber for us to make some chump blockers, so get a Polluted Delta into play, which will make us 2 mana thanks to the lens. So we can play out the Genesis Chamber, And then that can be a Bontu's Monument, I think, so that we can start draining our opponent and gaining a little bit of life. So play out our commander for just 1 mana, and like I said, drains our opponent to the Bontu's Monument, which triggers the Genesis Chamber for a mere token. And might as well play out the Carrion Feeder as well, once again draining our opponent. And let's go feed the Swarm onto that thing, because yeah, that's going to be a real problem for us, I think, especially with the Menace. So yeah, there we go, we're getting all our individual pieces into play, we're just having difficulty in pulling it all together. The fact that this only triggers once a turn does make it particularly bad, but I understand that they needed to put that caveat on it, although they did release Sithis, an Enchantress commander, for 2 mana. And yeah, so maybe could have gone for a legendary Blood Artist effect that doesn't just trigger once a turn. Maybe make it only drain your opponent for 1, but it can trigger indefinitely. Anyway, we see a Sword of Truth and Justice, so they can start distributing plus counters. And not swinging in with Yoshimaru, just dealing 6 to us in the air. A plus counter likely goes on an Inkling, and they'll proliferate another one onto Yoshimaru. And then it is a Grateful Apparition. And there is the Bloodchief Ascension. Apparently we've gone too slow again this game. Yeah, and now we draw into the Swamp. Excellent. So it's Black Market Connections. We'll just draw an additional card here. Alright, and there is a Blood Artist, so not likely that we're going to do anything. Like I said, we've gone too slow here, but we'll play out a 1 mana Blood Artist, drain our opponent for 1, and they get us on the swing back next turn, I imagine. Genesis Chamber triggers upon Blood Artist's entry, so we can sacrifice a Mere token to trigger the Blood Artist and the Vraan, and that will make sure that we get that 3rd counter on the Bloodchief Ascension. Yeah, if we'd had something like the Yawgmoth here, I think we would have done better, but we can still survive this one and maybe get into something next turn. I wouldn't have thought that we'd be able to do too much of anything though. There is a doubling season, so they'll be able to proliferate after they've already attacked, so that doesn't necessarily do us much harm. It's a bit win more at this point. So we stand to take 9 damage here. Obviously don't have any flyers to block with. So the Grateful Apparition goes on the stack first. Sword of Truth and Justice, putting a counter on something. I imagine it is the Grateful Apparition it goes on. No, deciding to put it on the equipped creature here. And then they go for the Proliferate, so yeah, you can see what they want to do with the deck here. They get to proliferate twice, once thanks to the sword and once thanks to the Apparition. And obviously we are down to 1. Our opponent's down to 1 card in hand. We'd need some kind of infinite combo here, which I don't think I bothered including in the deck, to be honest. This was just supposed to be a fun aristocrat build more than anything. And then our opponent puts the Sword of Truth and Justice over to the commander. We will sacrifice a Mere token so that we can draw an additional card. And that triggers the Vraan this turn as well. So, alright, a Phyrexian Reclamation. We lose 2 life to the Black Market. Yeah, and a Bastion of Remembrance. I still don't think we can get there because our opponent's pretty high on life here. Haven't managed to get into any of the Edict effects or a Damnation or anything that we would have needed. So let's play it out for the fun of it. Let's go Bastion of Remembrance. That makes us a token. And then we can play the Reclamation Sage. We can sacrifice something and then play it out again, I suppose. We could grab back Solemn Simulacrum with the Phyrexian Reclamation as well, although I don't see what that would do. But we'll just do it anyway and see what we were drawing into here for the fun of it. Obviously we lose the 2 life to the Phyrexian Reclamation. We were just drawing into a swamp anyhow, so there was absolutely nothing we were doing there. Just too slow against our opponent. Yeah, like I said, Vraan not triggering every single time that it sees a creature die is pretty bad. I'd rather it only drained for 1 and then it triggers every time it sees a creature die as opposed to just once a turn. I think it's way too slow, although we were up against 2 finely tuned decks at the end there, so if you want to see more from this commander then I will run it again, but I'll keep a very close eye on the views and the thumbs up on the video. I'm tribalkai. Thank you for watching.